It was the evening of April 12, 1975, and the Omni Coliseum in Atlanta, Georgia was buzzing with the kind of frantic energy that always preceded an Elvis Presley concert. Roadies were making final adjustments to the massive sound system, backup singers were running through their harmonies one last time, and security guards were positioning themselves at every entrance and exit in preparation for the arrival of 15,000 screaming fans. The atmosphere backstage was controlled chaos, a precisely choreographed dance that Elvis's crew had performed hundreds of times before. Everyone knew their role, everyone knew their timing, and everyone knew that the show would go on exactly as planned because that's how Elvis Presley concerts worked. There was no room for error, no tolerance for delays, and absolutely no deviation from the carefully constructed schedule that got the king of rock and roll from his dressing room to the stage at exactly the right moment. But on this particular evening, something was different, something was wrong. And the first person to notice was Joe Esposito, Elvis's trusted road manager and one of his closest friends for over 15 years. Joe had been with Elvis through everything, through the early days of rock and roll revolution, through the movie years in Hollywood, through the legendary 1968 comeback special, and through the grueling concert tours that had defined this latest chapter of Elvis's extraordinary career. Joe knew Elvis better than almost anyone on the planet, and he knew immediately when something was off. And right now, at exactly 5:30 in the evening, with the concert scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock, something was very, very off. Elvis was gone. Joe had last seen Elvis in his dressing room about 45 minutes earlier, going through his usual pre-show routine of vocal warm-ups and costume adjustments. Elvis had seemed distracted, Joe remembered later, quieter than usual, like there was something weighing on his mind. But Joe hadn't thought much of it at the time because Elvis often got contemplative before performances, using the quiet moments before a show to center himself and prepare for the explosion of energy he would unleash on stage. It was part of Elvis's process, and Joe had learned long ago not to interrupt it. But now Elvis was nowhere to be found. His dressing room was empty, his white jumpsuit still hanging on its rack, his makeup untouched on the vanity table. Joe checked the bathroom, checked the hallway, checked every room backstage that Elvis might have wandered into. Nothing. The king of rock and roll had simply vanished. Joe's first instinct was to stay calm. Elvis was a grown man after all, and he had a right to take a walk if he needed some air. But as the minutes ticked by and Elvis failed to reappear, Joe's concern began to grow into something closer to panic. They had a show to do. 15,000 people had paid good money to see Elvis perform, and many of them had traveled hundreds of miles for the privilege. The band was ready, the crew was ready, everything was in place except for the one person who actually mattered. Joe gathered the rest of Elvis's inner circle, the group of close friends and associates who traveled everywhere with Elvis and handled every aspect of his professional and personal life. Charlie Hodge, Elvis's longtime friend and stage guitarist, hadn't seen him. Sonny West, one of Elvis's bodyguards, hadn't seen him either. Nobody had seen Elvis leave the building, but somehow he was no longer in it. It was Red West, another of Elvis's bodyguards and oldest friends, who finally figured it out. Red had noticed something earlier that he hadn't thought significant at the time. About an hour before Elvis disappeared, a woman had approached the backstage entrance asking to speak with someone from Elvis's team. She was middle-aged, Red recalled, with tired eyes, and the kind of worn-down expression that came from carrying a heavy burden for too long. She had a letter in her hand, and she was asking if there was any way to get it to Elvis personally. Red had done what he always did in such situations. He had politely taken the letter and promised to pass it along, fully expecting it to end up in the pile of fan mail that accumulated by the thousands wherever Elvis went. But something about this woman had made Red actually read the letter instead of just tossing it on the pile. Maybe it was the desperation in her eyes, or maybe it was the way her hands trembled as she handed over the envelope. Whatever it was, Red had opened the letter right there in the hallway, and what he read had stopped him cold. The letter was from a woman named Dorothy Patterson, and it was about her son, a 10-year-old boy named Thomas, who was dying of bone cancer at the Emory University Hospital, just 3 miles from the Omni Coliseum. Thomas had been fighting the disease for 2 years, the letter explained, and the doctors had recently delivered the devastating news that there was nothing more they could do. Thomas had weeks to live, maybe less, and he was spending what remained of his life in a hospital room surrounded by machines and medications that could ease his pain but could not save his life. The letter went on to explain that Thomas was the biggest Elvis Presley fan in the state of Georgia, possibly in the entire world. His hospital room was decorated with Elvis posters and photographs, and he spent his days listening to Elvis records on a small portable player that his parents had brought from home. When Thomas learned that Elvis was coming to Atlanta to perform, he had begged his mother to find a way for him to see the concert, But Thomas was too sick to leave the hospital, too weak to sit in an arena seat for 3 hours, too fragile to be anywhere except the sterile safety of his hospital room. Dorothy Patterson wasn't asking for concert tickets. She knew her son couldn't attend. She was simply asking if there was any way at all, that Elvis might acknowledge her son's existence. Perhaps a signed photograph, she suggested, or a brief note wishing him well. Anything that would let Thomas know that his hero was thinking of him, even from a distance. She knew it was a lot to ask, she wrote, and she would understand completely if it wasn't possible. But she was a mother watching her child die, and she had to try. Red West had been with Elvis for over 20 years, and in that time he had seen thousands of fan letters, many of them containing heartbreaking stories of illness and tragedy. He had learned to maintain a certain emotional distance from these letters, because if he let every sad story get to him, he would never be able to function. But something about Dorothy Patterson's letter had gotten through his defenses. Maybe it was the quiet dignity of her request, asking for so little when she was losing so much. Maybe it was the way she described Thomas's love for Elvis, not as a casual fandom, but as a genuine source of strength that was helping her son face the unthinkable with courage. Whatever it was, Red had made a decision that went against everything he had been trained to do. Instead of putting the letter on the pile, he had walked directly to Elvis's dressing room and handed it to Elvis personally. Elvis had taken the letter without a word. He had sat down on the couch, still in his street clothes, and he had read it slowly, carefully, his lips moving slightly as he absorbed every word. When he finished, he had looked up at Red with an expression that Red would never forget. "Where is this hospital?" Elvis had asked, his voice quiet but firm. Red had told him. Emory University Hospital, about 3 miles away, maybe a 10-minute drive with traffic. Elvis had nodded slowly, as if he was making a decision that had already been made somewhere deep inside him long before this moment. Then he had stood up, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the door. Red had tried to stop him, of course. They had a show to do. 15,000 people were counting on Elvis to be on that stage at 8 o'clock. There wasn't time for a hospital visit, wasn't time for anything, except getting ready for the performance that everyone had paid to see. But Elvis had just looked at Red with those famous blue eyes, and he had said something that Red would remember for the rest of his life. "Red, that little boy doesn't have time. He might not have tomorrow. He might not even have tonight. Those people in the arena, they'll still be there when I get back. But that boy needs me now." And then Elvis was gone, slipping out a side entrance that led to the parking lot where his limousine was waiting. He didn't take any of his entourage with him. He didn't call ahead to warn the hospital. He didn't bring any photographers or publicists or anyone else who might turn his visit into a media event. He just got in the car and told his driver to take him to Emory University Hospital as fast as possible. When Red explained all this to Joe Esposito, Joe's reaction was a mixture of frustration and admiration that perfectly captured the complexity of loving Elvis Presley. On one hand, they had a show to do, a schedule to keep, obligations to fulfill. On the other hand, this was exactly the kind of thing that made Elvis who he was, the spontaneous generosity, the genuine compassion, the willingness to put another person's needs above his own convenience. Joe had seen Elvis do things like this before, though never quite this close to showtime. He knew there was no point in trying to stop Elvis once he had made up his mind about something like this. All they could do was wait and hope that Elvis made it back in time. At Emory University Hospital, no one was prepared for what was about to happen. The evening shift had just begun, and the nurses on the pediatric oncology ward were going about their usual routines of medication distribution and patient checks. Thomas Patterson was in room 412, a private room at the end of the hall that offered a small measure of peace and quiet for a child who was enduring an unimaginable ordeal. His mother, Dorothy, was with him, as she had been almost constantly for the past 2 years, reading to him from a book while his father worked the night shift at the factory to pay for the medical bills that were slowly destroying the family's finances. Thomas was having a particularly bad day. The pain in his bones had been severe that morning, and the doctors had increased his medication to levels that left him drowsy and disconnected from the world around him. He had slept most of the afternoon, drifting in and out of consciousness while his mother watched over him with the helpless vigilance of a parent who knows there is nothing she can do to fix what is broken. But around 6 o'clock in the evening, something had roused Thomas from his medication-induced sleep. He had opened his eyes and looked at his mother with unusual clarity, as if the fog had momentarily lifted from his mind. "Mama," he had said, his voice weak but present, "is Elvis really coming to Atlanta tonight?" Dorothy had felt her heart break a little more, which she hadn't thought was possible given how shattered it already was. She had told Thomas about the concert weeks ago. back when they still harbored the impossible hope that he might somehow be well enough to attend. That hope had long since faded, but Thomas still asked about it, still imagined what it would be like to see his hero perform in person. "Yes, baby," Dorothy had answered, smoothing the hair back from her son's forehead. "Elvis is playing at the Omni tonight. Thousands of people are going to see him sing." Thomas had closed his eyes, a small smile crossing his pale face. "I wish I could be there," he had whispered. "I would tell him that his music makes me feel better. Even when everything hurts, his music makes me feel like everything is going to be okay." Dorothy had been about to respond when she heard a commotion in the hallway outside Thomas's room. There were raised voices, the sound of rapid footsteps, and what seemed like general confusion among the hospital staff. Before Dorothy could go to the door to see what was happening, the door opened and a nurse stuck her head in with an expression of complete bewilderment on her face. "Mrs. Patterson," the nurse said, her voice unsteady. "There's a man here to see your son. He says his name is Elvis Presley." For a moment, Dorothy was certain she had misheard. Or perhaps she had fallen asleep and was dreaming, because what the nurse was saying was absolutely impossible. Elvis Presley was supposed to be at the Omni Coliseum right now, preparing for his concert in front of 15,000 fans. There was no conceivable reason why he would be at Emory University Hospital asking to see her son. But then the nurse stepped aside and Dorothy Patterson saw something that she would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. Standing in the doorway of her dying son's hospital room was Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, dressed in simple street clothes with no entourage, no cameras, and no fanfare, just a man who had come to see a little boy. "Mrs. Patterson," Elvis said softly, his voice gentle and sincere, "I got your letter. I hope it's okay that I came." Dorothy couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She just stood there staring at this impossible vision, this legend who had somehow materialized in the most unlikely place at the most unlikely time. It was Thomas's voice that broke the spell. "Mama," the little boy said from his hospital bed, his eyes now wide open and shining with disbelief. "Mama, is that really Elvis?" Elvis walked over to Thomas's bed and sat down in the chair beside it, positioning himself so that he was at eye level with the little boy. He reached out and took Thomas's small, frail hand in his own. "Hey there, Thomas," Elvis said, his voice warm and genuine. "I heard you're a pretty big fan of mine. I wanted to come and meet you myself. What happened over the next 20 minutes was something that no camera recorded, no reporter documented, and no publicist promoted. It was simply a conversation between a dying child and the man whose music had helped him face his impossible situation with courage and hope." Elvis asked Thomas about his favorite songs, and Thomas told him about how he listened to Love Me Tender every night before he went to sleep because it helped him feel less scared. Elvis asked about Thomas's family, and Thomas proudly introduced him to his mother, who was still standing frozen in disbelief by the window. Elvis talked to Thomas about what it was like to perform on stage, about the nervousness he felt before every show and the joy he experienced when he connected with his audience. And he told Thomas that performing was really about making people feel something, about reaching into their hearts and giving them a moment of happiness or comfort or peace. And he told Thomas that knowing his music had helped a brave little boy fight through the hardest battle of his life meant more to him than all the gold records and sold-out concerts in the world. At one point, Thomas asked Elvis if he would sing something for him. Elvis looked around the hospital room with its beeping machines and sterile white walls, and then he smiled. "You know what, buddy," Elvis said, "I don't have my guitar or my band here with me, but I'm going to sing for you anyway, okay? I'm going to sing your favorite song just for you." And there, in a quiet hospital room at Emory University Hospital with no microphone, no backup singers, no adoring crowd, Elvis Presley sang Love Me Tender to a dying 10-year-old boy. He sang it softly and sweetly, his famous voice filling the small room with a warmth that seemed to push back against the cold reality of what was happening there. He sang it directly to Thomas, never breaking eye contact with the little boy who was watching him with an expression of pure, transcendent joy. When the song ended, Thomas was crying, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of wonder, of the kind of happiness that comes from having an impossible dream suddenly become real. Dorothy was crying too, and even Elvis had to wipe his eyes before he could speak again. "Thomas," Elvis said, reaching into his pocket, "I want to give you something. I want you to keep this with you and remember that you have a friend who is thinking about you and praying for you every single day." Elvis pulled out a small gold medallion on a chain, something he wore around his own neck every day. It was a religious medal, a symbol of faith that Elvis had carried with him for years. He placed it gently around Thomas's neck, adjusting it so that the medallion rested over the little boy's heart. "This is my lucky charm," Elvis explained. "It's kept me safe through a lot of hard times, and now I want it to keep you safe. Whenever you feel scared or alone, you just hold on to this and remember that Elvis is your friend. Can you do that for me?" Thomas nodded solemnly, his small fingers closing around the gold medallion. "I'll never take it off," Thomas whispered. Never ever. Elvis stayed for a few more minutes talking with Thomas about the future, about dreams, about all the things that a 10-year-old boy should be thinking about instead of hospital rooms and cancer treatments. He avoided any mention of illness or death, focusing instead on hope and strength and the power of believing in something bigger than yourself. When it was finally time to go, Elvis hugged Thomas gently, careful not to cause any pain to the boy's fragile body. "I have to go sing for some folks now," Elvis said, "but I want you to know something. Tonight, when I'm up on that stage, every song I sing is going to be for you. I'm going to look out at that big crowd and I'm going to pretend that you're right there in the front row singing along with me. Can you do that too? Can you listen to my songs tonight and pretend that we're singing together?" "I will," Thomas said, his voice stronger now than it had been all day. "I promise I will." Elvis turned to Dorothy, who had finally found the strength to approach him. "Mrs. Patterson," Elvis said quietly so that Thomas couldn't hear, "your son is one of the bravest people I've ever met. You should be very proud of him." Dorothy tried to thank Elvis, tried to express what this visit meant to her son, to her entire family, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was take Elvis's hand in both of hers and look at him with eyes that said everything that her voice could not. Elvis seemed to understand. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, then turned and walked out of the hospital room without looking back. Back at the Omni Coliseum, chaos had been building in Elvis's absence. Joe Esposito had been forced to make excuses to venue management, telling them that Elvis was dealing with a personal matter and would be there as soon as possible. The concert's start time had been pushed back by 30 minutes, and the audience was growing restless, 15,000 people wondering what was keeping the king of rock and roll from his throne. When Elvis's limousine finally pulled into the loading dock at 7:45, there was exactly 15 minutes until the rescheduled showtime. Joe rushed to meet Elvis as he climbed out of the car, ready to hustle him through makeup and wardrobe at record speed. But Elvis just walked past him, heading for his dressing room with a calm determination that made it clear he wasn't going to be rushed. "Joe," Elvis said without breaking stride, "give me 10 minutes. I need to be alone." Joe wanted to protest, wanted to remind Elvis that thousands of people were waiting, that the venue was charging them by the minute for going over their allotted time, that there were 100 professional and financial reasons why Elvis needed to get on stage immediately. But something in Elvis's voice stopped him. Something in Elvis's eyes told him that whatever had happened at that hospital was more important than any concert, any schedule, any professional obligation. Elvis went into his dressing room and closed the door. He stayed there for exactly 10 minutes, and to this day, no one knows what he did during that time. Perhaps he prayed for Thomas Patterson. Perhaps he sat quietly and gathered his strength for the performance ahead. Perhaps he simply allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had just experienced, the encounter with mortality and courage and love that had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. When Elvis emerged from his dressing room, he was transformed. He was wearing his famous white jumpsuit with the peacock emblem. His hair was perfect, his stage makeup was flawless. But there was something different about him that night, something that everyone who was there noticed but couldn't quite explain. There was an intensity in his eyes, a purpose in his movements that went beyond his usual professional polish. Elvis took the stage at 8 o'clock sharp, and what he delivered over the next 2.5 hours was one of the greatest performances of his entire career. He sang with an emotional depth that brought audience members to tears. He moved with an energy that seemed to defy the physical limitations he had been struggling with in recent months. He connected with the crowd in a way that felt personal and intimate, as if he was singing to each of the 15,000 people individually rather than performing for a massive crowd. Nobody in that audience knew about Thomas Patterson. Nobody knew that Elvis had spent the pre-show hours at a hospital bedside instead of in his dressing room. Nobody knew that the gold medallion Elvis usually wore around his neck was now hanging around the neck of a dying boy 3 miles away. They only knew that they were witnessing something special, something that transcended ordinary entertainment and became something closer to a spiritual experience. After the concert, when the crew was breaking down the equipment and the fans were streaming out into the Atlanta night, Elvis called Joe Esposito into his dressing room. He was still in his sweat-soaked jumpsuit, exhausted from the performance, but strangely at peace. "Joe," Elvis said, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to find out everything you can about that little boy's medical bills. Whatever his family owes, I want to pay it off. All of it. But Joe, this has to stay between us. I don't want anyone to know it came from me. The family shouldn't know. The hospital shouldn't know. No one should ever know. Joe promised to take care of it, and he did." In the weeks that followed, the Patterson family received notification that Thomas's medical bills had been mysteriously paid in full by an anonymous donor. Dorothy Patterson tried to find out who was responsible, but she was told only that a private benefactor wished to remain unnamed. She suspected, of course. She knew in her heart who had paid those bills, but she had no proof, and she respected the donor's wish for anonymity. Thomas Patterson lived for 6 more weeks after Elvis's visit. His mother later said that those final weeks were different from the months of suffering that had preceded them. Thomas seemed more at peace, more accepting of what was coming. He wore Elvis's gold medallion every single day, clutching it in his small hand whenever the pain became too much to bear. And every night, Dorothy would put on Elvis records, and Thomas would lie there with his eyes closed, mouthing along to the words of songs he knew by heart. When Thomas finally passed away on May 28, 1975, he was buried with Elvis's gold medallion still around his neck. Dorothy had considered returning it to Elvis, had even written a letter explaining that she thought Elvis might want it back, but she never sent the letter. She knew somehow that Elvis would want Thomas to keep it forever. For almost 30 years, Dorothy Patterson kept the story of Elvis's hospital visit to herself. She had promised Elvis nothing, had made no formal agreement to stay silent. But she understood intuitively that what Elvis had done was not for publicity or recognition. It was a private act of compassion meant only for her son and their family, and she felt it would be a betrayal of that gift to share it with the world. But in 2003, when Dorothy Patterson was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, she made the decision to finally tell the story. She had carried it with her for 28 years, treasured it as one of the most precious memories of her life, and she didn't want it to die with her. She contacted an Elvis fan organization and gave them a detailed account of what had happened that day in April of 1975. She showed them photographs from Thomas's hospital room, including one picture that a nurse had secretly taken of Elvis sitting at Thomas's bedside. She shared the letter she had written asking for nothing more than a signed photograph, and she told them about the anonymous donor who had paid her son's medical bills. The story spread quickly through the Elvis fan community and beyond, touching the hearts of people who had never even been particularly interested in Elvis Presley before. It was the kind of story that reminded people why Elvis had become such an enduring icon in the first place. Not because of his music, though his music was extraordinary. Not because of his fame, though his fame was unprecedented. But because underneath all the glitter and glamour, Elvis Presley was a man who genuinely cared about other people, who used his position and his resources to help those who were suffering, and who did so without seeking credit or recognition. The story also revealed something important about Elvis that many people had forgotten or never knew in the first place. Elvis visited hospitals and orphanages and nursing homes throughout his entire career, not because his publicist told him to, but because he felt a genuine obligation to share his good fortune with those who were less lucky. He gave away millions of dollars to charities and individuals, often anonymously, and he never kept track of how much he gave because he didn't see it as something to be counted or measured. To Elvis, these acts of generosity were simply what anyone with his blessings should do. They were natural expressions of who he was, as essential to his identity as his music or his famous smile. Dorothy Patterson passed away in 2004, just a few months after sharing her story with the world. But before she died, she said something that perfectly captured what Elvis's visit had meant to her and to Thomas. Elvis only stayed for 20 minutes, Dorothy said in her final interview. But in those 20 minutes, he gave my son a lifetime of happiness. He made Thomas feel special, feel loved, feel like his short life had mattered to someone important, and he did it without asking for anything in return, without bringing cameras or reporters, without making it about himself at all. That's the Elvis I want the world to remember. Not the jumpsuits and the hip shaking, but the man who would leave his own concert to sit with a dying child because he knew that child needed him more than 15,000 healthy fans ever could. Today, Elvis Presley remains one of the most beloved figures in music history, and stories like Thomas Patterson's help explain why. His music may have made him famous, but his humanity made him immortal. The way he treated people, especially those who were suffering or marginalized, revealed a depth of character that transcended his public persona. Every year, on the anniversary of Elvis's death, fans gather at Graceland to pay tribute to the king of rock and roll. They play his music and share their memories and celebrate the joy that Elvis brought to millions of people around the world. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute to Elvis's legacy are the stories like this one, the private moments of compassion that never made the headlines, but that changed individual lives in profound and lasting ways. Elvis Presley could have stayed at the Omni Coliseum that night. He could have gone through his usual routine, performed his usual show, and never given Thomas Patterson a second thought. No one would have blamed him. No one would have even known that he had received Dorothy's letter, but Elvis wasn't that kind of person. He understood that his fame and success came with a responsibility to use them for good, to bring light into the darkest places, to offer hope to those who had lost all hope. And on that April evening in 1975, he fulfilled that responsibility in the most beautiful way possible by simply being present for a child who needed him, by giving freely of his time and his heart, and by showing the world what true compassion looks like. Thomas Patterson only lived for 10 years, but he died knowing that he was loved by the greatest entertainer of his generation. He died wearing a gold medallion that had once hung around the neck of the king of rock and roll. And he died with memories of a private concert in a hospital room, a performance for an audience of one that was more meaningful than any stadium show Elvis ever gave. That is the power of genuine compassion. That is the legacy of Elvis Presley. And that is why, almost 50 years later, stories like this one still have the power to move us, to inspire us, and to remind us of what truly matters in this world. If this incredible story of private compassion moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the smallest acts of kindness can have the biggest impact. Have you ever experienced a moment when a stranger's compassion changed your life? We would love to hear your story in the comments below. And do not forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss another amazing true story about the heart behind music's greatest legends.